23rd, 2000, A Tale of Two Kingdoms, Part 33. Okay, well, last week we traced the events that led up to the Second Bishops' War, the war itself, and the treaty negotiations that followed. In the events leading up to the war, we first noticed the rise of a, quote, moderate and radical party over the issues of conventicles, or private prayer meetings, and also the thoroughness of reforms in worship, although we unfortunately had to leave off what those reforms were, since my sources didn't indicate, and I haven't been able to yet find the article that might. The Second Bishops' War ended almost as soon as it began, in the sense that there was one single large battle in which the outnumbered English army was quickly routed. There had, of course, been other sort of sieges of castles and skirmishes and so on. But Charles was forced once again to negotiate with the Scots, but this time it was more costly. Just for the privilege of having a ceasefire, it cost £850 per day. And furthermore, Charles was forced to call a parliament, both because of the Scottish demands that they be a party to any treaty, and also because he couldn't afford the £850 a day. And the so-called Long Parliament was called on the 3rd of November, 1640. The peace treaty was worked out. A peace treaty to bring a formal end to the war was worked out during the end of 1640 through about June of 1641, although it wasn't formally signed until August of 1641. So, okay, today we're going to cover the events leading up to the English Civil War, so I'd like to give an apology, not apologize, but give my apology for doing this, and that is that the English Civil War is something that the Covenanters become embroiled in, and this document known as the Solemn League and Covenant comes about because of this negotiations with the English Parliament. And it really, I guess it still has some bearing today, and the question that we're going to try to look at, as to who signed the Solemn League and Covenant in England and Ireland and so on, and to what, I don't know if we'll answer to what degree we're responsible for it, but that's at least something we'd like to have the background for. So we're really not going to have very much to do with Scotland today. A little bit. Charles does visit Scotland. But we'll mostly be working on the events that lead up to the English Civil War. I want to give you a picture of what happens in England. By way of a very summary introduction of this book, The Civil Wars, A Military History of England, Scotland, and Ireland, 1638 to 1660, published by Oxford Press, or I guess it's Oxford University Press. It's theoretically edited by John Kenyon and Jane Ohlmeyer, only John Kenyon died during the production, so his former colleague Jane Ohlmeyer took it over. Interesting enough, this guy was from Oxford and then became a department head at Hall and department head at University of St. Andrews. But I think his last academic position, I may not have this quite right, but I think his last academic position was at the University of Kansas, where he had a chaired position of early modern British history. So, but in the introduction, which is written by Jane Ohlmeyer, she's talking about his Kenyon scholarship and specifically on the English Civil War. And I just thought few paragraphs are pretty interesting. Kenyon resolutely refused to find long-term economic and social causes of the great events of the British and Irish Civil Wars. And while he found much complaining and the articulation of much prejudice on matters of law, government, religion, he did not find an escalation of conflict in anything remotely inevitable or predestined about the descent into violence. And then this, quoting him, almost every historian from S.R. Gardner, i.e. from the 1880s, down to Lawrence Stone in 1972, traces the cause of these events back to 1603, to 1558, even to 1529. They are, in fact, devotees of the theory of historical inevitability, which has been called, in less reverent terms, the rolling stone theory. According to this hypothesis, a stone dropped on the mountain heights, say in 1558, rolls irresistibly down the slopes, gathering momentum as it goes, dislodging larger boulders, scree and snow, creating a cumulative movement which bursts on the unsuspecting villages below as an avalanche. In its place, Kenyon offered a foreshortened chronology. It is impossible not to turn to a tactical or political explanation and find causes of the Civil War in the state of the monarchy. First, its general weakness, which unbalanced the working constitution, as many contemporaries realized. And secondly, the perverse ineptitude of Charles I and some of his advisors, which triggered off a series of crises, beginning with the Scottish National Covenant of 1638, which made civil war inevitable. The Rolling Stone, in fact, started rolling when that celebrated maidservant, Jenny Geddes, threw her stool at the Dean of St. Giles, Edinburgh, on the 23rd of July, 1637. So, of course, I'd have a slightly different view of the Rolling Stone theory, believing God is sovereign over it all, and that we might be able to look back and see things that pick up, but definitely would deny the historical inevitability theory of history. So I thought that was interesting that historian, looked at it and said, well, the real cause of this is this, where it started was in this throwing of the stool. And I guess I've mentioned a number of times, I felt partly vindicated, mentioning that, even now, Charles, if he just compromised, he probably could have averted the situation. But no, he had to go on. So, anyways. Okay, by the time that the treaty was signed, Charles had significant problems on his own with his other subjects besides the Scottish subjects. In February of 1641, while the negotiations were going on, Parliament had considered the root and branch petition. I found this alluded to a number of times. I finally had to look it up in the Wordsworth Dictionary of British History, where it says that it was intended to abolish episcopacy with all its dependencies, roots, and branches. Okay, so in the end, it never did pass, but that it was under consideration and was read a couple times. That same spring, the House of Commons and House of Lords debated the fate of the Earl of Strafford. Right, we mentioned last week that he'd been executed. They finally passed a Bill of Attainder, which, if the king would sign, would cause him to be executed, would result in him being executed. The king, who had earlier promised that he would, quote, never let his minister suffer in life, honor, or fortune, finally conceded under the political pressure and signed the Bill of Attainder. He was remorseful about it after the fact, but Strafford was executed in May of 1641. Yes?
What was that bill?
A Bill of Attainder. It's a bill against a specific individual. You're a threat to the kingdom, off with your head, sort of thing. I don't know if that's the only meaning of it, if that's what it means here. It's a bill against a specific person passed by Parliament. Okay, by the summer of 1641, England was a hotbed of unrest, and a lot of the same issues that we saw in Scotland 100 years earlier, or 80 years earlier, say in the late 1550s and early 1560s, were issues. And there's, in some respects, it's reminiscent of that time, with the unruly crowds and so on going around destroying icons and the like. And in some respects, it seems to me even, I don't know if wilder is the right term, but there was certainly a lot of sort of Protestant movements that went beyond sort of Presbyterianism in Scotland, well beyond. I'm going to read, this is from a book by Christopher Hibbert called Cavaliers and Roundheads, the English Civil War, 1642 to 1649. This is sort of the, in the introductory part of the book, he gives his view of the state of London anyways, and the rest of the country to some degree in 1641. If I got this right. The execution of Strafford seemed to excite the appetite for revolutionary measures of those members of the Long Parliament who were eager for further reform, who were determined upon what the nonconformist preacher Edmund Calamy described as a second Reformation. According to one observer, Reformation went on as hot as toast, while nonconformist sects proliferated and the extreme amongst them grew ever more outlandish. Though few so outre as the Muggletonians, who condemn both prayer and preaching, and the Adamites, peculiarly hysterical descendants of the brethren and sisters of the free spirit, who conceive themselves as being in that state of innocence obtaining in the Garden of Eden before the fall, and believing it appropriate to worship God in Adam and Eve's condition of nakedness. Now, this is by no means the norm or anything like that. This is just the extreme example, but if you read some of the other things, you're going to find just kind of what I might think of as bizarre sort of directions, extremes that some of the people have gone to. Inspired by preachers and pamphleteers, by female preachers leading congregations in extempore prayers, and by Puritan writers like John Milton, who castigated the clergy of the Church of England for stumbling into, quote, new vomited paganism, their prayer book for being the, quote, skeleton of a mass book, and their communion table for being, quote, pageanted about like a dreadful idol. Apprentices chased Anglican parsons down the streets, calling them abbey lubbers and Canterbury whelps, and tearing the gowns from their backs. From all over the country, now and later, there came reports of altar rails being torn down and altars overturned, of prayer books being thrown about churches and graveyards, of vestments being stripped from the backs of Laudian clergy, of attacks upon those opponents of Calvinist doctrines known as Arminians, and of bishops menaced by gangs of women who threatened to hang them with their lawn sleeves. In one church, some wild sectaries, provoked by the curate's kneeling as he administered the sacrament to his parishioners, kicked the communion bread up and down the chancel. In others, candles were trampled underfoot, crucifixes and organs broken, and stained glass windows smashed. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre without Newgate, a woman encouraged her child to urinate on the communion table. In Newcastle, women were said to be tearing up surplices as well as prayer books. In Kidderminster, there was a riot when some members of the parish objected to the church warden's removal of a crucifix from their churchyard cross. The sectaries make such havoc in our churches, wrote one observer, by pulling down ancient monuments, glass windows, and rails, that their madness is intolerable. At Norwich, the bishop, Joseph Hall, was driven out of his palace, which was left without so much as a dozen of trenchers or the children's pictures, and his chapel and the cathedral were desecrated and wrecked. Lord, and this is him, Lord, what work was here? What clattering of glasses? What beating down of walls? What tearing up of monuments? What pulling down of seats? What wresting out of iron and brass from the windows and graves? What defacing of arms? What demolishing of curious stonework? What tooting and piping on the destroyed organ pipes? And what a hideous triumph on the market day before all the county, when in a kind of sacrilegious procession, all the organ pipes, vestments, copes, and surplices, together with the leaden cross which had been newly sawn down from the greenyard pulpit, and the service books and singing books were carried to the fire in the public marketplace, a lewd wretch walking before the train in a cope trailing in the dirt, with a service book in his hand, imitating an impious scorn the tune and usurping the words of the litany. So they were out of control, and they were, and I think you see they were out of control in a measure. It seems beyond what we found in the Scottish Reformation. Okay, so he goes on to talk about destruction at Canterbury, where Puritan clergymen made use of a guidebook to the cathedral to demolish many window images, many idols of stone, 7 large pictures of the Virgin Mary, and a window dedicated to their prime cathedral saint, Archbishop Becket, with cope, rochet, mitre, crozier. Now it is more defaced than any window in that cathedral. Okay. Oh, the minister, carrying out the desecration, being then on top of the city ladder, near 60 steps high, with a whole pike in his hand, rattling down Becket's glassy bones, in other words, the panes of glass from the window. To him it was said, "'Tis a shame for a minister to be seen there. Some wished he might break his neck, others said it should cost blood." So, yeah, we'll stop there. It goes on. I mean, just in terms of the destruction and the riotous nature of it, it goes on. But it gives you an idea of the sort of situation in England, and of course, it wasn't only sort of Puritans and over-the-top Puritans, right? There were also sort of royalists and Anglicans who were upset about matters and so on, but they weren't, of course, tearing down the churches, which is what most of that was about.
It sounds like what happens when the lights go out in New York City. It's just an excuse for everybody to open the bulls when they hit the title or something.
Something like that, yeah.
It doesn't sound like there was, like, these were certainly not carried out by sincere churchmen. It doesn't.
No. But I mean, nevertheless, it did happen, and the independency streak, I mean, shows itself up in all kinds of sort of bizarre behaviors. Let's see. In August, Charles visited Scotland and presided over a parliament. while there he was somewhat compliant. He was apparently hoping to break the Covenanters' alliance with the English Parliament. Before he left, I know one thing he did was he knighted and gave earldoms and so on to a number of the Covenanters. So. Okay, one issue that had been left open in the treaty negotiation was the appointment of officers of state. So the Covenanters had wanted the authority of their parliament to, say, approve or veto the king's nominations, if you will. They wanted to check on his power to appoint the chancellor and treasurer and various officers of state. And this had been left somewhat vague, and as a result, when he came, there was a long dispute over who would be the chancellor. And during this, I think Charles finally despaired of winning over the Covenanters, and to some surprise, they didn't trust him. Okay, but finally, some royalists who, quote, were more loyal than wise, cooked up some kind of plot to seize leaders, Argyle being one, also including the Earl of Hamilton, right, who had been the king's commissioner, but apparently was thought to be siding with the Covenanters. And there was some extent which he probably was. I think he was sort of looking to the future. Even though he hated Scotland next to hell, all his estates were there, and so all his income was derived from Scotland. So maybe he just sort of saw the handwriting on the wall. Okay, this plot came out before it happened, and although there isn't any direct evidence that the king was complicit in the plot, afterwards his behavior made him look like he sanctioned it. So the Covenanters had a full investigation of the plot, and this just served to further undermine the king. And a bit of deja vu here, you remember that James, if they made too big of an event of this plot, then remember James had made a big event of this quote uprising in Edinburgh a number of years before and had used it as sort of a media event to get his way. Okay, Charles ended up returning to London in mid-November. He'd made a large number of concessions to the Covenanters, and yet I think he knew at this point they still really didn't trust him, and he was no closer of his goal of getting them to side with him against the English Parliament. Okay, towards the end of his visit, on the 23rd of October, 1641, the Irish rebelled. Now, you recall that one of James's, James was so brilliant and so smart that he had come up with this plan to help settle some of the Scottish in Ireland. Okay, the Ulster Plantation was established around 1608 after there had been some rebellion in Ireland, and some of the Irish lords fled to the continent and so on, and he used this as an opportunity to seize a bunch of land and move Scottish Protestants into Ireland. Right, Ireland was predominantly Catholic. Well, okay, and so hence the source of the troubles even to this day. But during the uprising, thousands of Protestants were murdered. Thousands more were forced from their land, pillaged, plundered. Many died of sickness or hunger. More recent scholarship has put the number murdered in the initial uprising at or around 4,000, but at the time it was claimed to be over 150,000. And I don't know, whatever the actual number, right? Many more were pillaged, plundered, and so on. It was a real tragedy, and the cruelty was remembered and it was repaid for many years to come.
They were targeting the Protestants?
Yes, yeah. They were targeting the Protestants, who, a lot of were small landholders and so on, and also sometimes had lent some of the Irish money. So some of the first ones killed were those who were owed money. So. Okay, in England, the uprising was known as the Queen's Rebellion. The Queen, who was from France, was a Catholic, and her enemies claimed that she was secretly supporting the uprising. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that's what was claimed. Meanwhile, in England, the conflict between king and parliament continued. In November of 1641, the parliament sent the king their grand remonstrance, which listed 200 clauses detailing their complaints. And many of the complaints were about the English church, which Charles still maintained was not in need of reform. Again, he could have compromised, but he didn't. He dug in his heels here. Partly because the House of Lords was more evenly divided on the matter, so he thought he could sort of win in Parliament with the House of Lords. So he made his stand. He refused to consider reforming the English church. He ordered crackdowns on all these crowds of protesters wandering the streets. Then, in sort of the beginning of the end, he ordered the arrest of 5 members of Parliament. And one was John Pym, P-Y-M, who you may have heard of. I don't know if the other names probably aren't familiar. But these were the more activist members of the House of Commons. Technically, he needed this order for arrests to be confirmed by the House of Commons. And of course, this wasn't going to happen. So the Queen and one of her friends advised him to go down to Parliament and arrest the men himself. She is reported to have put the order to him in the following, I called it Hillary-esque language. Go, you poltroons, go and pull those rogues out by the ears or never see my face again. Somehow it sounds like the kind of thing Hillary might say. I wonder if I don't know if she's ever called Bill a poltroon, but I wouldn't be surprised. So on the 4th of January, 1642, he went down to Parliament with 400 armed men. When he arrived, he found that none of the men were in the house. But by this time, he'd pretty much shown himself as a true tyrant. So let's see. I want to read a little more from Hibbert, just to help look at the sort of set the stage again for what's happening there. Well, let's see. Leading up to this, he issued a proclamation ordering the city of London, to surrender the 5 members. And he marched to the Guildhall himself to demand a meeting of the Common Council, that they should be handed over to him. His words were greeted with shouts of privileges of Parliament, to which he responded, no privileges can protect a traitor from legal trial. Let's see. He returned to Whitehall, his coach surrounded by people shaking their fists at him as they shouted abuse through the windows, and by others no less loudly crying out, God bless the king, and cursing that rogue Pym. One of those averred that he would go 20 miles to see Mr. Pym hanged, and would then cut off a piece of Mr. Pym's flesh to wear about him in remembrance of him. London was now in uproar. Shops had closed their doors. People had come out into the streets in their thousands. Women collected stones to throw at soldiers who might be sent into the city to drag out the 5 members variously reported to be hiding in Coleman Street, Cornhill, or Red Lion Court. Stools and tables were thrown into the roadway to hinder approaching horsemen. Royalists, who a few days before had been chasing citizens about Westminster with their swords, now prudently chose to stay indoors. Rumors flew from mouth to mouth. The king's supporters were going to launch an attack on the city and planned to hang Mr. Pym outside the Royal Exchange. Barricades were erected, chains pulled across the streets, cannon dragged towards crossroads, cauldrons taken to the top of buildings, so that boiling water could be poured down upon the heads of advancing troops. The Inns of Court regiments declared their support of the House of Commons, as the government of the city had already done. Volunteers poured into the city to offer their services in its defense. Apprentices from the brickfields at Bethnal Green and Spitalfields. Iron workers from Southwark. Thank you, Simon. Watermen from Bermondsey and Shoreditch. Silk workers from Bermondsey. Yeah, there, thank you. I knew I was going to get into a piece where I needed some advice here. Silk workers from Spitalfields. He nods for the tape. He nodded his head. That pronunciation was okay. Okay. The houses of Roman Catholics were attacked. Let's see. The Lord Mayor was called upon to summon the trained bands, those companies of armed citizens originally raised to maintain order in the city and to suppress riotous behavior. But the Lord Mayor at this time was Richard Gurney, a former silkman's apprentice who had been left a fortune by his master, and subsequently married a very rich wife, and as a zealous royalist, Gurney refused to issue the summons. The trained bands mustered anyways, by whose order no one was sure, and soon 6,000 citizens were standing ready to withstand any troops the king might bring against them. Okay. Well, with the conditions in the city being what they were, on the 10th of January, the king left Whitehall for Hampton Court, fearing for the life of his wife and perhaps his own. Well, I don't know if he was fearing for his own, but supposedly for the life of his wife. They moved on to Windsor, and shortly thereafter, the Queen and Princess Mary traveled to the continent, where Mary was to join her new husband, and where the Queen was to look for military aid. She wasn't successful in looking for military aid, but she carried with her letters requesting military aid. Actually, I don't know if she was completely unsuccessful, but so far I haven't found any evidence that she was. On the same day, Parliament issued an ordinance, in other words, a law not signed by the king, but just done on their own authority, which gave them control of the army. After the Queen and Princess Mary left, Charles began a progress to the north. She rode to Royston, Cambridge, Huntington, kind of along the A1 there, along the A1, so to speak, and then off to Lincoln, Stamford, and York. This is sort of up the east, not quite along the coast, but more or less up the eastern part of the country. It took several months, and meanwhile in London, Parliament reigned supreme. On the 22nd of April, again 1642, he sent a party of courtiers to the town of Hull. Right? Hull is, I don't know, maybe 20 miles from York, something like that. Hull. Hull. 50 miles, okay. Sure it's that far? Okay. Well, Simon says it's 50 miles. Okay. Hull is a port town. It had a well-stocked castle with ammunition, artillery, and supplies. The Queen had advised the king to seize the town so that when she got all this military aid, that she could ship it, to that port. When he arrived there, he found the gates closed, and they shouted down that His Majesty could not enter the town. One of the king's party shouted up for someone inside to throw the governor over the wall and open the gates themselves. And when no one complied, he was forced to basically turn around and go back to York. So, on the 1st of June, Parliament issued their 19 propositions, which required parliamentary control not only of the army, but of the church, the royal children, the law, and of all officers of state. This is Hibbert again. They were in effect tantamount to a demand that the king must surrender all executive power. Outraged, he immediately rejected them, condemning their authors as raisers of sedition and enemies to my sovereign power, as would-be destroyers of rights and properties, of all distinctions, of families and merit, persuading many waverers that Parliament had indeed presented him with an ultimatum that could be accepted only with dishonor. But by this time, the entire country was putting itself on a war footing. Again, just from Hibbert, which... just give it, again, a little bit idea of the situation. All over the country, unrest was growing and sides were being taken in bitterness, sadness, and anger. As castles were fortified, sentry boxes installed by the gates and city walls, trained bands ordered to keep watch in magazines, as posterns and bridges were barred at night, as horsemen were put through their paces, gentlemen studied such textbooks as Henry Hexam's Principles of the Art Military as practiced in the wars of the United Netherlands, and farm workers and yeomen were drilled in town squares and country fields. In Leicester, the mayor was sternly warned not to read the King's Commission of Array by the Puritan Lord Willoughby of Parham, who had been appointed by Parliament to a military command in the area, and who proclaimed Parliament's militia ordinance instead, provoking the Earl of Huntington's son, Henry Hastings, to attempt to capture the city with a company of colliers he had called up from the mines on his family's estates. In London, the royalist Lord Mayor did manage to read the King's Commission of Array, but soon found himself in the Tower for his pains. Elsewhere, the publication of the rival proclamations was attended by uproar and violence. You'll have to help me with this one, Simon. It looks like Cirencester. Cirencester. Okay, Cirencester. The Lord Lieutenant was chased out of the town when he tried to read the King's Commission. In Cambridgeshire, the Lord Lieutenant was similarly maltreated, and the palaces at Downham of the Bishop of Ely, one of the greatest papists in the kingdom, was invaded and ransacked. At Watlington in Oxfordshire, the royalist Earl of Berkshire was silenced by John Hampden, and his coach was smashed to pieces. There were clashes in Somerset where a Puritan hurled a stone at a crucifix, in a gesture of hatred for symbols of popery common to nearly all counties, and where the Marquis of Hertford, the Lord Lieutenant of the county, was driven out of Wells by Sir Edward Hungerford and forced to retreat into Dorset and then into Wales. Okay, so he goes on to talk about there's more destruction of... let's see. There was fighting, too, in Worcestershire, where a rabble of other would-be iconoclasts, wild in their hatred of what they took to be idolaters, had been driven across the county boundary. And in Shropshire, crowds pelted effigies of the parliamentarian soldiers, already known as Roundheads because of their close-cropped hair, which, like that of apprentices who cut their hair short to demonstrate their contempt for lovelocks, was in marked contrast to the flowing tresses of the royalist cavaliers, the caballeros, who were derived for their supposed attachment to the ways of foreign Catholics. And, quote, from the Puritans' custom of wearing their hair cut close round their head, heads with so many little peaks as was something ridiculous to behold, Lucy Hutchinson explained. That name of Roundhead became the scornful term given to the whole Parliament party, whose army indeed marched out so, but as if they had only been sent out till their hair was grown. 2 or 3 years after, any stranger that had seen them would have inquired the reason of that name. So, anyways. There were a number of minor skirmishes starting with basically one party or the other intercepting arms, preventing their opposite number from recruiting soldiers and so on. On the 15th of July, Charles began a siege of Hull. Okay, the governor, who was a very flexible man, had understood that it might be in his financial best interest to allow the king to open the gates of the city to the king. And he suggested to the king that he might set up siege works, fire a single cannon shot, and at which time, having fulfilled his obligations to Parliament to defend the city, he would open its gates to the king. So the king tried this, set up a siege works and so on, but unfortunately Parliament had also sent an experienced Scottish soldier, Sir John Meldrum, to help stiffen the resistance. He did, and the city didn't open its gates to the king. Okay, so the king gave up on Hull, and he decided to march south towards London. And on the 22nd of August, 1642, he raised his standard in Nottingham. Let's see. The king's proclamation, which proclaimed that the commons and the troops were traitors, was read. At this point, the king only had about 1,000 troops, and the situation looked rather desperate. But on the 6th of September, Parliament passed a measure that declared that all men not supporting the Parliament were delinquents, whose property could be seized. And that had the effect of forcing the hand of many a man who might otherwise have remained neutral, now felt compelled to support the royalist cause, even if they didn't particularly approve of Charles. So actually, at that point, Charles started gathering troops, and by the 23rd of September, the first sort of major battle was fought at Powick Bridge near Worcester. So that's the beginning of the English Civil War.
Was Cromwell in charge yet?
No, Cromwell was not in charge yet. He was a member of Parliament.
Is he a member of Parliament?
Yes. So, this is the background then for the Solemn League and Covenant, and I want to cover it this week because otherwise this whole idea of how the English got into the Civil War is I thought would be a bit vague, and I think to give you an idea that it's certainly a divided populace. Support for Parliament, I think, ultimately is much stronger than the Royalist support, but it's not as if it was only the king against everyone else. There was quite a bit of Royalist support, although there wasn't enough Royalist support in the end. So, questions?
Well, what would you say is the key reason for Parliament setting itself up?
Well, it's just, I think you can look. It's been a series of events where they've clashed with him. Going back to when in 1629 he had sort of the last Parliament for over 10 years until 1640 or 1639. So he hadn't actually had Parliament. He'd been raising money illegally. Come up with various sort of taxes and user fees. That sounds familiar. So I think that's the primary thing, that he tried to rule without Parliament for a long time. Then he called them back into session, and this was to address before the First Bishop's War, to sort of call the army out. I'm sorry, before the Second Bishop's War, to call the army out. And they wanted to address their grievances and complaints. And so he then banished them again. They were only called back into session because he was really absolutely stuck. He'd been defeated by the Scots and was having to pay £850 a day, and he couldn't raise the money any other way besides calling a Parliament. And then once they were called, Kenyon points out that basically the monarchy was weak, and they certainly antagonized him by just demanding more and more and more. And I'm sure at some point he felt like he could never concede enough ground. So, I don't know, but there's a lot of religious, rest that's part of it. The whole thing with that started with, just John Kenyon mentioned, with Jenny Geddes. Right? There's still a lot of the parliamentarians are Puritans, and he's refusing to consider any reformation of the church. So, I think it's a combination of things. It's not just one factor, but they did very much get at odds with him. Rob?
Where was Parliament get their army at this time? Did they really have much of an army?
I don't know at the beginning how much of an army they had. I mean, they formed, they reformed the army partway through, right, the new model army. Right there in London, they had 6,000 trained men who were part of, the militia, were the quote trained bands. Not too sure about the rest of the army though. So
Did the king have a standing army, or did you just have to call people?
you just had to call people, volunteers you could find. Yeah.
You didn't really have an army at this time.
Well, there was apparently an army, right? And that's what this militia bill was about. It said that the Parliament asserted they had control over the army. But I really don't know very much. Haven't read very much about how big their army was, or so on. So I tried to concentrate on the sort of events leading up to the war, and I don't plan to spend much time on the battles and so on. As interesting as that might be. So Rob, I'm sorry, I can't give you a much better answer than that. I'm not sure. I know at the beginning of the war there was some comparison of the armies, and the claim was generally that the parliamentary army tended to be older and more taciturn and made up of older servants and so on, whereas a lot of younger people had gone to fight for the royalists. But I don't know. I don't have any kind of systematic research into it. Other questions? Okay. Dan, you want to close in prayer?